everybody. I think we're just about ready to begin. My name's Tim Atkinson, and I'm the new university librarian here. And first, I want to acknowledge our presence on traditional Nanaimo First Nations territory. Welcome to all of you, and on behalf of the colloquium organizers, I wish to thank the Dean of Arts and Humanities, Dr. Ross McKay, and his staff for the support of the colloquium series. And I'd also like to thank the theater for hosting us today and providing technical support and the Media Research Lab for filming this event. At the start of the colloquium, it's customary to have someone reflect on the importance of the arts and humanities. For me personally, the arts and humanities formed the bedrock of my academic education. But they also helped to form me as a person, although at the time I may have been too focused on the grade on my next paper to have really understood how things were changing me. It was through discussions with my professors, both during and out of class, that I learned to think and challenge my own assumptions. Those classes taught me to dissent with reason and civility, and to be tolerant of the thoughts of others, even when they collided with my own. At the time, I didn't even realize that I was acquiring this important set of skills. But as I've thought about those essential characteristics, I've realized that generations of students have learned, in essence, to be citizens within our complex democracies through those types of classes. The ability to have civil yet dissenting discussions is one of the cornerstones of our society. And in arts and humanities classrooms, our professors model that behavior and teach not only content, but skills around civilized behavior that we then take out into our world as citizens. Today, there seems to be a devaluation of these disciplines. But the outcomes of those classrooms, the ability we give people to act with reason as our citizenry, underpins many of the institutions and processes that our ancestors built. We must not only preserve what we have in this realm, we must expand it. And we have to make our governments understand that we all benefit from this type of learning, and it must be valued. For me as an individual, my academic life prepared me to truly participate in the democracy I live in. I have written letters and emails to officials at all levels of government. I have participated in community organizations. And the skills I most often tap into are those I learned from my professors: communication, tolerance, passion balanced by reason, and civility, even as I dissented. Those things are part of the foundation of our sometimes fragile democracies, and are just as or more important than preparing for a career or a profession. I have deep respect and admiration for my professors, and I know that the arts and humanities professors here at VIU bring that same commitment to their students and communities. Thank you for letting me share that and my personal experiences. And now our colloquium speaker will be introduced by Nanaimo's distinguished literary ambassador and treasured member of the VIU family, Thora Howell.
Thank you, Tim, and lady, welcome to Nanaimo. It's lovely to have you at the library. Am I okay with that voice? Yeah. Mike? I was delighted to be invited to introduce Joy. For as long as I've known her, her passion for Canadian literature, for authors, publishers, and readers has been a beacon in an increasingly pressured publishing world. I first met Joy in the mid-90s when she was editor for Beach Home Press. Not only did she acquire manuscripts, but she edited them, and miracle of miracles, she promoted them, a concept that had escaped most Canadian publishers. By then, she had graduated from Carleton University with highest honors degree in journalism, followed by a master's in Canadian studies. She became the editorial director of fiction at Raincoast Books. We in the book-selling world were thrilled to see exciting new books from upcoming authors, many from BC. Joy has been editor-in-chief for 3 citizen journalism online magazines, as well as on the editorial boards of 3 distinguished literary magazines, Arc, Quarry, and Room. She and 15 students in the journalism program published the exciting Portal magazine, a self-funded annual full-color literary magazine. Her journalism experience has included monthly on-air programs for CBC Radio and the hosting of Primetime Bravo. Her reviews have been published in the Globe and Mail, the Vancouver Sun, and the Ottawa Citizen. In addition, she has hosted our Chili's Book and Bites and Write On for CKCU. Joy has acquired and edited over 80 literary and young adult titles, including ones by Bill Gaston, Michael Crummy, Terence Young, Adam Schroeder, Patrick Friesen, and our own John Wilson. She has acquired and edited texts that have been nominated or won awards, which include the Giller, the Governor General's, BC Book Prizes, the Timothy Finley Award, and the Canadian Library Book of the Year, and a host of others. She currently edits annual titles in the Ralph Gustafson Distinguished Poets Lecture Series. One of the most innovative undertakings, and one the dearest to my heart, is the writing camp that she co-founded for children's ages 8 to 11 held at the Vancouver Public Library each year. She began instructing in the Simon Fraser Master's Program of Publishing and Summer Publishing Workshops in 1996, and has taught the core editing courses at Ryerson since 2002. And if that's not enough, she operates Chameleon Consulting, Change Your Mind, freelance editing. No wonder Quill and Choir, the official trade publishing magazine, once named her one of the top 30 under 30 in publishing. Since joining the creative writing and journalism and media studies faculty at VIU in 2010, she's taught 12 courses in publishing, done over a dozen directed studies, and offered courses in interactive communications, emerging digital technology, online digital literacy. She champions student-centered and hyper-contemporary experiential learning in a historical content. She supports interactive discussion that connects theory and practice, sharpens critical, analytical inquiry, and seeks to bridge academia and industry. She strives to introduce students to the most current books, business models, ideas, and technological advances, and encourages them to respond to concepts with innovation, experimentation, and the creative application of skills they have acquired. She allows for different learning styles and a variety of voices and opinions. She's invested much time helping excellent students. Two events that have happened to me recently have made me aware that we need to address finding ways to connect young people to literature. One was a book, and another was an event. Earlier this week, I attended an event at the Port Theatre with 600 other people, many of whom were young. What was special? It was a poetry reading. I would suggest that 600 animated people at a poetry reading in Nanaimo tells us there's a desire to hear writers and poets tell our stories. And then a few weeks ago, I read The End of Absence, Reclaiming What We Have Lost in a World of Constant Connection by Michael Harris, winner of the 2014 Governor General's Award for Nonfiction. His premise is that we are experiencing a moment akin to the invention of printing. No succeeding generation will experience a non-digital society. A revolution's happening. The education of young people will require much more innovative approaches. The presentation today is taken from Joy's doctoral thesis in communications at Simon Fraser. We know she's grounded in print and digital media. She understands how learning takes place, and she's passionate about finding ways to connect young people and Canadian literature. Please welcome Joy Gugeler. Let's win the war on CanLit, firing the cannon to higher than.
Thank you so much, Tim and Thora. We're a long way from those cozy launches in Bookstore on Bastion Street, yet I can feel the warmth of the literary hearth this morning, just in hearing your words. So, from an early age, I escaped into the secret world. The garden hedge, the wardrobe, the rabbit hole of a book, emerging only to select a new title and re-immerse. At 11, I won a contest at the local library by reading 100 books in a single summer. The prize, lunch and an interview with Canadian writer W.P. Kinsella of Shoeless Joe fame. Though he doesn't likely remember my precocious questions and earmarked notebook, the exposure to a real live author made a lasting impression. So much so that after journalism and Canadian studies degrees at Carleton, what I really wanted to do was make them, not write them, just edit and publish them. I also wanted to capture the thrill of that summer. So in August of 2000, I launched the inaugural Canadian Book Camp for 120 young adults, a reading and writing mini BAMF for tween writers in residence that is still taking over the first floor of the Vancouver Public Library 15 years and 1,800 pint-sized aspiring authors later. Not only was I thrilled to be seeing myself in a book, not only who I was, but who I could be, and I wanted this captive audience to find it in the books I'd published in them. When John Lepage and Don Thompson asked me to speak to you today, it was that breathlessness, that passion for a topic I'd imagined, but it was also to put a gun at my back to finish the endless PhD from which this is excerpted. Attempting to do justice to 300 pages in under an hour will put the fear of God in you. My friends and family can attest to the fact that I am the poster girl for what not to do as a doctoral student. Don't work full time, don't let your advisor give you a long leash, don't take your eye off the prize. The prize had originally been to write something that would light a fire under the educators so that others wouldn't have to discover at 19, as I did in the first year CanLit classes, that there was a whole wealth of titles I had not known about as a voracious high schooler. Something had to be done. It seemed what was needed was a modest proposal, as Swift would say, for the uses of literature, our literature. And so I set about writing it, fire issuing from my fingertips. I wanted to ask and answer the rhetorical question, why teach our literature? Not because I believed the hopefully small conservative movement to abandon literature in the schools in favor of easier definitions of text is legitimate, but because the hypothetical position offers a chance to rebuke the down with the arts naysayers, to outline the skills, or in the parlance of curriculum developers, the learning objectives. Literature is ideally suited to develop. Even more essential in this learners to earners, only study what can get you a job, Harper era. What follows is an argument for the uses of literature, an argument I suspect is preaching to the choir. But it is worth rehearsing to limber up the vocal cords for debates still raging in the classrooms of the nation. An argument that literature's inherent qualities, and here I'm referring specifically to Canadian novels in English as a case study, though Canadian plays, poetry, short stories have suffered similar neglectful fates, how they ideally equip us to be nourished, not as gruesomely as Swift's solution to the potato famine, but just as ingeniously, with the mental sustenance that feeds both mind and soul, ready to be reaped in abundant supply in our own backyard. It proposes to satiate a reader's hunger for imaginative fare by consuming literature, varied, relevant, and of excellent quality, and provide an imaginative diet essential to the health of a student citizenry. An abbreviated list of the value-added benefits of the study of literature reveals the following. Literature offers students the world around them and worlds they've never seen. It empowers them to silently and individually challenge the prescriptive powers of inherited ideas. It creates a private space in which to escape, muse, and feel, while offering a safe site for experimenting with identity. It gives them the ability to fashion a context for their own experience and to communicate with the past. It revives the legacy of those who have come before and commits it to personal and cultural memory. It builds community as a member of a family, a culture, a tribe, a nation, a citizen of the world. It teaches them to make sense of their lives through narrative, to test beliefs, to believe in the magic of words. It offers the reader choice and assigns her pleasure, power, and vision. It allows for an active rather than passive role in the interpretive process. It accepts every reader and offers immersion, focus, quiet, and resistance when needed. Literature retells history, both sustaining and extending it. It connects us to the stories of our childhood while inspiring our own story, a new story. It creates a path from one author to the next and invites us to follow in their footsteps. Literature offers the curious teen armchair experiences, vicarious exploration, and endless virtual realities. Literature may even be a dream dreamed alongside our common reality, a symbolic system that trains us, however indirectly, for life in the real world, while simultaneously taking us out of it. Fiction confers artful and persuasive personal truths against a canvas of universal or constructed ones. No doubt these goals appear lofty to those concerned with making students literate rather than literary. What time is there for all this when they are tasked with teaching sentence structure, spelling, punctuation, and grammar? Yet cannot these skills best be taught in an artifact that exemplifies the potency of language? To stop short of appreciating words in their glory is to deny the experiment. Perhaps some teachers are afraid students will be unable to master language when distracted by novels that could frustrate rather than instruct. But why learn by rote rather than art? Canada's own Morley Callahan concurred. My inner eye comes to life. It's as if a story I'm reading, the figures come to life on the screen of my own imagination. Language, just words, is making the miracle. The skills noted above do more than teach by example. They simultaneously enthrall and empower. They run the gamut of emotions from the thrill of discovery to the comfort of recall, to the novelty of creation, while negotiating the parallel worlds of the symbolic, the remembered, and the illusory. These skills are valuable. These skills set readers apart from those without them. These skills will get you a job. The act of reading for most students is associated with memories of being read to, though admittedly, not all children experience this, or learning to read in their own childhood. Acts that occupied a leisure time and space when books were chosen by instinct. How can we return to this process, so reaffirming and comfortable, so as to reinforce its power rather than dilute it? Somehow, in high school, this has morphed into a mandatory and prescriptive act that leaves little room for reader preference. These stories are ones to which a student can make a quiet contribution, a subversive tale secretly related to an entrusted confidant and citizen occupying the same country, literally and literarily. If students select the stories that speak to their own lives, this shared experience makes a friend of a book and a community of a classroom that has brought them together. In order to rediscover the power of reading our own stories, we must recapture the private thrill in this now public forum. As academics, we have always given literature a place of privilege and continually contribute to its growing library. It occupies a role so sacred, there's no need to defend it to each other, though we find ourselves frequently doing so in other venues. But when we carry the debate, nay, the revolution, into the streets and into the schools, we are held to a different standard. Here, literature, or put less suspiciously, fiction, must do something. Yet so many of its benefits exist beyond the reach of the conscious mind, or are only seen to have accumulated in hindsight. One of the most obvious byproducts of reading literature is its ability to please, a quality that should recommend it on this basis alone. Yet pleasure is rarely a word we see in the curriculum. Perhaps this emotion obscures the effort that has produced it, making it more difficult to ascertain if learning has occurred, if the objective has been met. As Robertson Davies asserted, incidentally, your reading may bring you information or enlightenment, but unless it brings you pleasure first, you should think carefully about why you are doing it. It is safe to assume that a student anticipating pleasure will be more likely to pick up a book than one who is told he must learn from it. Surely a room of enthusiasts is preferable to a room of discontents, reluctantly tolerating an exercise. When the right material is selected, and here student participation in the choice is key, it produces a class of readers who read for pleasure but not for idleness, who read for pastime but not to kill time, who love books but do not live by books. It may be a vitamin, but it looks like a hamburger. Too often, students who loved reading as a child emerge as bored and dissuaded youths in high school because the classroom failed to pick up where those childhood rhymes and stories left off, building on the groundwork laid by all the books and characters that accompanied students through their formative years. Do we not owe it to them to recreate and enlarge the magical community that has brought them to the brink of adulthood? If students choose what they read from a short list of pre-selected titles teachers are familiar with, And if that library is refreshed regularly, the relationship with literature is less one of taskmaster and servant. The bored reader is choosy, but youth who feel the choice of books in the classroom is ignoring them are indicating a distaste for particular books rather than all books. They are not obstinate because they are selective. Yet the perception that contemporary Canadian youth are either illiterate or too lazy to pick up a book is now such a commonplace as to go largely unchallenged. And it has produced a single-mindedness in the research literature, and especially the popular press, that has eclipsed virtually all other discourses, casting a long shadow over the ways in which young people's relationship to literature and publishing is understood. To counter this discourse, I and Jean Baird, then of the Writers' Development Trust, in 2002 undertook a national survey of 333 students in grades 11 and 12. We wanted to see what students, reluctant or otherwise, did read, and what this might say about how to engage with them more effectively. While it is unfair to extrapolate an entire youth culture from these responses, they do help to sketch a partial picture of teens aged 14 to 18, and the factors that determine their literary habits. The result revealed a majority of students preferred a species of fiction that was readily available, cheap and easy and foreign. Of course, it was American. One teacher lamented that students are so deeply encultured by American genre fiction, horror especially, that they don't respond well to literary fiction. Only 31% of students surveyed could name even 5 books they'd read for personal enjoyment, with the following writers appearing frequently on the lists. V.C. Andrews, Stephen King, R.L. Stine, Tom Clancy, John Grisham, Danielle Steele, J.K. Rowling, J.R.R. Tolkien, S.E. Hinton, and J.D. Salinger. Only the last 2 of these books are found on course lists, and as such represent the more risque of the curricular titles in that they represent rebel heroes in unsavory situations. For many teens, genre fiction offers the foolproof choice, with a predictable experience delivered as a guarantee. It also appears less intimidating in mass market, is cheaper than less reliable trade fiction, literary fiction, and is widely available in drugstores, loaned, or at garage sales. Robert Wright said in his book Hip and Trivial, Youth Culture, Book Publishing, and the Graying of Canadian Nationalism, that taken together, young people's relative shortage of earned income and their already considerable obligatory curricular reading responsibilities mitigate against both the acquisition of personal libraries and the likelihood that they will spend their free time reading. However, access does not necessarily equal taste. The teen market is constantly courted by film, music, clothes, magazines, sports, high-tech, video game, or food retailers, and has become so powerful as a cohort that its pockets are constantly being picked. With money being spent on purely leisure items, it seems more a question of enticing youth to consider books, e-books, or in print, as an alternative or supplement to these other pursuits or items. It would stand to reason that if their exposure to literature in the classroom has not recommended the experience, they'd be less likely to seek out literature for fun. But this is a reversible predicament. Genre fiction may also signal freedom from the thornier issues of their world: bullying, eating disorders, suicide, split homes, teen pregnancy, racism, coming out, pressures for sex, drugs, and the litany goes on. Or of texts associated with the demands of study. Is it any surprise that fantasy and science fiction are also genres of choice for many teens, given these allow students to play a role in shaping and imagining alternatives to the world they live in? Sven Burkert says in the Gutenberg Elegies, "We do not learn so much from the novel itself, the lessons of its situations, as we do from having strayed free from our customary boundaries. On return, those boundaries seem more articulated, more our own. We understand their degree of permeability, and this is a vital kind of knowing." And British author John Fowles says, "This is only what fictional books have always done through the clumsy medium of print, taken readers out of themselves and transported them to other places and events, personalities and psychologies." Genre fiction is also dominated by a handful of popular and visibly endorsed best-selling writers who consequently escape the stigma of being unknown and therefore unacceptable to peers. Only 10% of students said they read book reviews, 56% relying instead on word-of-mouth recommendations from friends. This indicates a subpopulation of readers that inform each other. Should the same network be used to harness enthusiasm for titles taught in the classroom, a considerably larger audience might come to know and cherish books that could compete with this fare. What books students did read in school, they identified with punishment and saved their own reading for the summer when they didn't have to read for class. Reading for pleasure happened at home, in a leisure environment, perhaps subliminally reenacting the primal experience of reading as a child, and signals a need to duplicate the culture of recreation in the classroom itself. Interestingly, only 63% of respondents could identify the last 5 books they'd read in school. Those who could named F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Golding, S.E. Hinton, Harper Lee, George Orwell, William Shakespeare, John Steinbeck, and John Wyndham, 4 American and 5 British writers. It is unknown if these books made any impression, an impression worth volunteering on the survey because they were enjoyed, because they were the most recent, because they were virtually the only things taught, or because they were studied most extensively. All of these titles are considered classics and have been in circulation in the high school curriculum for the better part of a century. It may be true that they were cited here because they also brought the students pleasure in reading them, but it does not follow that they are therefore the only titles capable of doing so. The consistency with which these were referenced indicates a remarkable concentration of titles, considering the national scope of the survey, and the absence of a national protocol that specifically incites teachers to use these works. It goes a long way to suggesting an unwritten canon is on offer in most classrooms. Northrop Frye has said that the world of the imagination is a world of unborn or embryonic beliefs. If you believe what you read in literature, you can quite literally believe anything. As students progress through their teen years, aggressively confronted by those peddling an increasingly broad set of belief systems, it would seem essential they are given an arena to test these beliefs, though through fictional characters and situations, and to determine which hold true in their own lives. Interestingly, their capacity for suspension of disbelief allows them to examine what it is they do believe in. This may signal a loss of innocence, but one comparatively harmless considering those they may feel compelled to try, if denied a stage on which to have them acted out by others. As noted, students' enjoyment of a literary work, while a private and guarded act that finds community within the book, can also find community through it, can be enhanced by the sport of reading the book aloud. Some might say this interplay between the solitary and the communal is the heart of civilization. We build houses because we are alive. We write books because we know we're mortal. We live in packs because we're gregarious. We read because we know we're alone. Reading offers companionship that fills no void, yet no other being can take its place. If the student or student orator is particularly mesmerizing, his or her voice may become inextricably linked with the text and the experience itself. This throwback to story time of childhood is duplicated today through audiobooks or podcasts and could be extended to recordings of their own radio-audio dramatizations made using their phones. In this way, reading moves seamlessly to bridge both realms. Understanding and interpreting text and all the skills necessary to the task are not lost to childhood, but an extension of it. Like the parent whose voice ushered us into that make-believe world, the teacher is just the go-between. Now it is time to steal away on his tiptoes and leave the students to replace his voice with their own through recordings or video for book trailers, vlogs, or any combination facilitated by the ever-present devices in their pockets. In this way, they establish a pace for the book, a tone that is unique to them, that they own. In the interim between classes, the student may mistrust the glittering surface of words and burrow into the darkness to make sense of the language and the story for herself. Herein lies the true essence of study, the internal debate between what has been said about and through the book and what the reader innately knows to be true about the story vis-a-vis her own subtle connection to it. As students immerse themselves in the story before them and the story of their own lives, They engage in what Edward Said calls the act of public dispossession, a stepping away from what has been said about the text publicly and a step toward private opinion. But this personal knowledge is hard-won. As most texts taught in the classroom are classics, published before the student's lifetime, they come with the weighty baggage of years of academic study, multiple interpretations, and no end of theoretical application and biographical data about the author herself or himself. While these studies are often immensely helpful and enlightening, they can have the effect of rendering the student's own readings redundant, novice, or ill-informed. It's a truism that every reading is in itself allegorical, the object of other readings. Dependent on a mental library of references rarely afforded students at the high school level. The daunting task of unpacking this baggage can sometimes intimidate students into a silence born of assumed inferiority. If every book requires, or at least benefits from, the readings of other books, then Paul Lemann's statement that allegorical narratives tell the story of a failure to read has serious implications. How do teachers encourage the investigation of both the primary text and the secondary literature that supports it, while still allowing room for their students' original thoughts? Consciously or unconsciously, teachers and students often feel that in order to read at even a skin-deep level, the reader requires information about the text creation, historical background, specialized vocabulary, even that most mysterious of things, the author's intention. And yet, provided reader and text share a common language, any reader can make some sense out of the text. Perhaps this common language is not literally English, but the language of mutual recognition. Both student and text must see each other as real, legitimate, worthy of time spent together. Not all books meet this objective, and consequently not all books succeed in gaining the student's respect and attention. But if the student chose from a quality field, perhaps it might. Furthermore, how does this secondary literature come about if not from fresh readings, by successive generations of students eager to add their thoughts to an ever-expanding debate? Surely this includes high school students, for why discount an entire population's criticism simply because it is youthful, or assumed to be without serious accreditation? Students must be made to feel a part of something larger, ongoing, vital, in short, to be joining a field of inquiry that awaits their input. Literature has developed into a series of self-regenerating texts that has unfolded under progressive readings, not superseding but rather including all the previous ones. Newer texts are less likely to come with the accessories of extensive criticism. A student who is part of the vanguard would surely feel more valued than one dragging her heels behind a pack. In an environment like high school, fraught with the cliques and unspoken codes of conduct, literature is refreshingly accepting of readers of any definition. This liberation is often lost once students see the book to be owned by the establishment, aka school, rather than to be reading against it. Unfortunately, rather than allowing the words with their freight of connotation to speed through us unrestrained, suggesting unimagined possibilities, a future cut loose from settled expectations, they fall limply on the page and are repeated by rote rather than as a call to arms. If teachers, or better yet students themselves, introduce books that are yet to be discovered or owned by school authorities, students are afforded more room to navigate and to find themselves in uncharted waters. Teens, a population that rarely wishes to be seen asking an adult for help, may instead ask the absent adult, the author, that ever-present and pressing question, who am I? By first answering the prerequisite question, what stories are my stories? Perhaps this is the true life of reading, the ulterior life, the slow, painful, delicious excavation of the self by way of another's sentences. In doing so, readers engage in a dreamlike conjuring of other lives, a seance that gathers the unborn and creates a self in the vicinity of words. Adolescence is the ideal laboratory for the study of reading and selfhood, and yet so much of the magic of reading is lost in the science of instruction. Just as a student is invariably asked to share the story of her life, literature illustrates an infinite variety of stories. Fiction is an opportunity to rearrange the facts, to make reality bearable by wrapping it in a blanket of agreeable invention. Without such an opportunity and such a choice, young people risk becoming not who they want to be, but who they are told to be. Deprive children of stories and you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions as in their words. Robert Fulford, in his Massey lecture, The Triumph of Narrative, uses the familiar tale of Peter Pan to illustrate this point. Peter describes himself as a lost boy who has not been told stories. That's why he can't grow up and inhabit stories of his own, as others do. He cannot become an adult because he lacks the narrative equipment. Literature invites us to identify the very components of our emotional selves, our desires and our insecurities, our hopes and our greatest anxieties. Each of us will find in the literary work the kind of thing we wish or fear the most. Perhaps, as Fulford suggests, we have to see our lives as a story because we can't bear to think that there's no meaningful structure in the way we develop. Reading as a species of self-discovery, and as such, Kafka's famous statement that one reads in order to ask questions is crucial to the way in which literature is taught. The nature of those questions is a function of the nature of literature. If only certain storylines and by extension identities are sanctioned and others, subliminally or overtly, deemed illegitimate, readers who associate with those identities are similarly welcomed or exiled. There will be many students in a classroom who will not find their doppelganger and thus will look elsewhere. These readers, like imaginative archaeologists, burrow their way through the official literature in order to rescue from between the lines the presence of their fellow outcasts, to find mirrors for themselves. Surely this means liberal rather than conservative choices, lest we scream at the students, "Get out, this is not for you." And yet so much of what we teach and how we teach seems to endorse this message, rather than reverse its effect. We need not permanently replace these texts, but instead rotate them, supplement them, allow students to choose from a shortlist that is necessarily more inclusive, more reflective of the heterogeneous mix teachers see before them. Naturally, literature is not the only story a high school student encounters. Whether it be the gossip of a text or tweet or a blog post or a YouTube video, the full range of storytelling waxes from the peasantry of gossip to the aristocracy of world literature. These provide a glimpse of the inner lives being lived around us. The glimpse will always be brief and tantalizing, like a landscape revealed for an instant by lightning, but it suggests a wondrous richness, a splendid variety. It rebukes glib assumptions about the blandness of our fellow citizens. In a culture of prosumers, producers, and consumers, where we can publish a story at the stroke of a key online, it follows that we expect our literature to be at least as interactive. Stories are born and die online and in gossipy whispers in a matter of hours, but in books, they last forever. Yet perhaps if literature were taught as a matter of life and death, the life and death of the story, students would feel a bit more inclined to keep it alive. Daniel Panak says reading is an act of resistance. When a book changed our lives, we didn't read it for but against something. We read and continue to read as an act of withdrawal, of rejection and defiance. If we entertain the prevailing stereotype of the rebellious teen, then literature that inspires such a reaction might be seen not as an obstacle to her expression, but as a means to her own revolutionary ends. Kafka said, "I think we ought to read only books that bite and sting us. If the book we are reading doesn't shake us awake like a blow on the skull, why bother reading it in the first place? What we need are books that hit us like a most painful misfortune, like the death of someone who loved more than we love ourselves, that make us feel as though we had been banished to the woods, far from any human presence, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us." A mind of one's own can only be sharpened by encountering the friction and fiction of contrary ideas. The act of deciphering where an author's ideas take up and your own leave off is a skill not to be undervalued. Doris Lessing said, "People who love literature have at least a part of their minds immune from indoctrination. If you read, you can learn to think for yourself." Furthermore, if readers are forced to move beyond their own experience to explore other cultures, races, classes, geographical terrain, emotional states as a voyeur, they might be simultaneously educating themselves out of the solipsistic assurance that their own experience is the ultimate experience. Not only do books provide access to a community of rebels, authors, and characters, They provide hundreds of reasons to rebel, hundreds of worlds in which to rebel. It is hard work, but it need not feel like it. Perhaps what is even more valuable is that, like any traveling, reading is at once a movement and a comment of sorts about the place one has left. And upon our return to the world we once thought reassuringly familiar, we discover it anew. How are we to appreciate where we are if we never leave? As Panak aptly notes, the paradoxical virtue of reading is that it takes us out of the world, so we might find meaning in it. In this way, literature belongs to the world man constructs, not to the world he sees, to his home, not to his environment. Perhaps literature's, indeed all art's, unique quality is that it attempts to appeal to the heart and mind simultaneously, something not always achieved without the scrim of the artist's invention. Northrop Frye says intellect and emotion never get together in your mind as long as you're simply looking at the world. They alternate, and they keep you divided between them. Literature does not only present the world as we know it, more often than not, it presents the world as we couldn't have known it, the world of the past. Fiction allows us to communicate with our forebears, to tap into that collective memory of a bygone era. This communication is both edifying and reassuring, for it is very satisfying for children to discover that their contemporaries in the past were bored, lonely, grouchy, bad, bullied, absent-minded, and weird. And to see that certain universal truths are acknowledged as such because generational shifts do little to affect them. Symbolically, they are better able to possess the past if they see themselves reflected in records of it. Literature allows this reflection in the same way that it is better to time travel than to hear about the past secondhand. Literature is the domain of the untrue or the partially true. It organizes the past so that it makes acceptable sense. Perhaps we might go further and even say bearable, endurable sense. As readers converse with characters and their creators, they speak to those absent men and women who lived before them, participating in a dialogue with the past just as each book continues a conversation with the books that have come before. History is no more dead than literature is, but vivifying it depends on students and teachers who can breathe life into the inanimate page. In an age when the buzz of consciousness and constant communication seems heightened to a feverish pitch, perhaps reading is also offering us a silence, a luxurious peace that we cannot find anywhere else. The novel or story creates a self-contained order, a place where the ambitious reader can go to counter the centrifuge of late modernity, where he can, at least for a time, possess the aesthetic illusion of focus and sustain a single-minded immersion in a circumstance no longer so generally available. Literature facilitates discovery of that buried self. Books tell us what we have it in us to know, but have not fully seized by our unaided efforts. Fiction is from the Latin word meaning to feign. We have art, said Nietzsche, that we may not perish of the truth. Surely allowing students to find their own truth in fiction is the art of teaching. We have discussed why we should read literature in the classroom and itemized the benefit it bestows, but what literature exactly should teachers teach? Attempts to answer this question inevitably lead to a re-examination of the high school canon. By understanding how canons are selected and why they remain so well preserved, indeed how they reinforce and reproduce the cultures and values of the subpopulation who create them, and how power is conferred and accrued to teachers and texts, is a short leap to how the task might be co-owned by the work's original audience, the readers themselves, who recognize quality not because they are told it exists, but because they have determined this on their own. Barbara Herrnstein-Smith reveals the classificatory strategies that preserve texts by making their survival of the fittest appear natural, self-evident, even deserved. Teachers and academics debate notions of intrinsic versus constructive value, select titles they believe to be inherently valuable. They affirm the title's power by expanding upon its merits in class, constructing its worth with every passing year it appears on a course outline. This raises an important question. Are teachers meant to reinforce value or discover it? Are they the only ones capable of doing so? What of texts that are individually and possibly only temporarily meaningful? Are they to be excluded in favor of the more obvious choices? Despite the polarizing nature of these discussions, there is a compromise position in which the center, canonical texts, and the margin, non-canonical texts, are mutually dependent, in which equally vital and legitimate works from the margin are studied along those they criticize, leaving larger conclusions to be drawn by a student reading across a wider spectrum. Arguing for the abolition of the canon may destroy existing counter-canons or anti-canons, but not the central canon itself, and it's a drastic response to a perhaps inevitable and human need to select and evaluate. What is more helpful and perhaps more applicable in the classroom is a liberal play of interest that articulates a more sophisticated and engaging multicultural drama. Most curricula suggest, rather than dictate the titles to be taught in the classroom, yet as we've seen, a particular list of books is still pretty consistently taught, subject to some additions, subtractions, substitutions, as a result of teacher preference. Canons reflect and in subtle ways reproduce that educational culture, the culture of those who teach them. This culture is not likely homogeneous, though it may appear so. Books that do not challenge this prevailing culture are most likely to circulate there indefinitely. Titles selected by students would reflect and reinforce their culture or cultures, whimsical and perhaps a function of weaker critical skills than the scholarly standard, but certainly not excluded for crudeness of sensibility alone. What might happen if a teacher proposed 5, 10, 20 Canadian titles she had read and deemed suitable, and students voted for those they wanted to study on the list? Could the teacher propose 5 and the class 5? Might student advocates argue for the book they nominated, a la Canada Reads, and win over both the teacher and fellow classmates? A system that allows for both groups to participate in the selection is both democratic and radical by today's standards. Teachers possess irrefutable and innate power derived from their status within the school community. So titles teachers endorse are also enjoy an ambiguous reputation that comes from its acquired authority and perceived power. The longer and more intensely a work is taught, particularly by a respected and influential teacher, the more intractable its place. But what if this power was conferred and students were presented with the same criteria for selection as teachers? Or better yet, be asked to suggest alterations to the criteria, were more involved in teaching themselves and their peers. Charles Altieri says, "We have possible selves, we need possible worlds." Should these worlds collide in the pages of a book and the books in a classroom? Students are capable of informing each other, but not often of informing the teacher. Their domain is horizontal, the teacher's vertical. Teachers are scholars, students are critics. The difference between may seem like splitting hairs, but this hierarchy is used to dismiss student criticism as intellectually suspect. Interestingly, the critical tasks of description, analysis, and assessment are ones teachers continually assign students and often practice themselves. Robert Fulford considers the term critic pejorative. Contemporary criticism seems to say that the perpetrators of literature have been getting away with something for hundreds of years and must be exposed. Professors and students turn into police officers. The SWAT team of critics arrives on the doorstep of literature and says, in effect, "Come out with your hands up and your hidden meaning clear." To make matters worse, teachers often imply their choices are master narratives or masterpieces, works the canon preserves for posterity. Masterpieces are cherished because literary authorities reward excellence and rate talent. These texts are often over-mediated and held up as talismans of worthy reading, the best of their kind. We can say about them what W.H. Auden said, "Some stories may be unjustly forgotten, but no stories are unjustly remembered. They do not survive through the vagaries of whim." Perhaps for this reason, the stories we remember as a society that we canonize are more accurately described as master narratives than masterpieces. They are variations on a story we already know, a derivative of a plot subliminally part of our culture. Masterpieces refer to specific titles by specific authors, whereas master narratives appear anonymous until they are associated with works that depend on the reader's recall. A master narrative is a dwelling place. We are intent to live in it and to make sense of the world through its eyes. Interestingly, a master narrative, as they fall from favor, canons that champion them also come under review. Robert Fulford said the master narratives by which our society traditionally guided itself, from the Bible to the agreed-upon stories of beneficial British imperialism and European ascendancy, have been challenged and largely discredited. The Cold War, a narrative that organized the way many people saw the world for more than 4 decades, has dissolved. Popular narrative on television has come to be seen as the opiate of the masses, the way religion was described long ago. Serious fiction writers are nervous about introducing too obvious narratives into their books, and yet humanity clings to narrative. We may mistrust the large-scale narratives that attempt to shape society, but our narrative drive persists. The master narratives Fulford refers to, like the canon itself, have come under significant fire in recent years, indicted for their privileging of certain white, male, Western, colonial, and Christian agendas that exclude much of what other cultures and religions, very well represented in Canadian classrooms, recognize as their reality. Intellectual life, it seems, runs on 2 ruling impulses, each of which dictates a set of attitudes. One impulse makes us organize, categorize, and package all knowledge. The other encourages us to prove that the organization was badly done, the categories poorly chosen, and the packaging inept and unfair. If master narratives can change because they are no longer relevant, then classroom canons can too. Yet there is a belief that these works have survived through a kind of cultural Darwinism. Often these writers and thinkers are held up as lights on the pathway to the good life of wisdom and virtue, harbingers of moral truth on the great classical quest to determine the nature of good and evil. Harold Bloom blames weak moral fiber on weak literary canons. Students might agree that current canons are ineffective, but they'd be unlikely to suggest Bloom's humanist tomes as the answer to contemporary malaise. Yet imagine a school that asks its students not only to read the great books, but to read those that might be great, whose greatness is yet to be determined in that very classroom. Robertson Davies said, "God save us from reading nothing but the best, lest we fail to hone our tastes by recognizing emerging writing as well as that which is established." Katha Pollitt, writing in The Nation, says, "If we were a nation of readers, there'd be no issue. These lists are suddenly so important because they represent very often the only serious work to which the student is ever likely to be exposed. Whoever controls the list comes out ahead in the struggle for the hearts and minds of the young." One of the means by which these hearts and minds come in contact with the canon in the classroom is the anthology. Increasingly popular for its affordability and 20 for the price of one offering, anthologies function as a portable canon, often purporting to contain the best that has been written over a specific time period in a particular country or by a certain subset of writers of a specific culture, gender, or political persuasion. Some argue anthologies are the most democratic, the least elitist literary medium, as they do not shine a spotlight exclusively on a single creator. Anthologies allow readers to shop for artists and works to determine whether they are worthy of their attention. Might students choose which stories to read in an anthology rather than the teacher? Which anthology to study? Which author to pursue for a longer independent study? How does dependence on anthologies limit student exposure to longer works and therefore possibly deny a fuller appreciation of the artist? While editors of anthologies were once concerned with the act of preservation, now they are selecting from abundance rather than protecting from oblivion. Might not students do the same? An anthology allows students to skim and wander and jump in and out of several narratives, whereas a single text demands the reader's exclusive attention is harshly judged when it is denied. And though some teachers believe that no single book could possibly cater to the diverse interests and levels of maturity and ways of reading in one class, an anthology offers the best odds as well as the most bang for the buck. Our survey reports the bulk of recent budget dollars have gone to anthologies that claim 50% Canadian content, and though some teachers like them because they're handy and cheap, most students claim they were safely manufactured to smell like a textbook. It is also hard to argue for sustained reading when students are not offered resources to encourage it. Students wonder why they should read the whole novel when the textbook only presents a few pages. Furthermore, in some schools, the move to semestered half-year courses has made it more difficult to teach longer works. The typical high school English course still has an assortment of short stories, poetry, a bit of Shakespeare, perhaps one other play, an essay or two, and a novel, but rarely more than one novel. There just isn't time to cover more in a 20-week course, according to teachers. Another novel in place of an anthology would mean compensating elsewhere, robbing Peter to pay Paul, something that would require more preparation time for teachers. For all of these reasons, some feel they are cheaper purchase, but they also cheapen the literary experience. Teachers unhappy with new or existing anthologies sometimes fashion their own through photocopied excerpts, salvaged from various works they know or prefer. CanCopy allows up to 10% of the original work to be reprinted without copyright violation, but cheaters are difficult to track. As each new edition of an anthology is published, the list of authors and works from which it can choose grows longer. There is a somewhat arbitrary selection, an abbreviation of a larger and more complex canon. Anthologies are also assumed to cement a direct relationship between nationalism and canon formation, precisely because works that reflect historical moments of consolidation, patriotism, and shared ideals often come to be equated with the events and spirit of the nation that inspired them. Shifts in national vision often coincide with the creation of a new anthology, a new group of writers whose work epitomizes the transition. This is contentious on many levels and has historically fanned the flames of debate. Though people are confronted with the achievements of other societies, past and present, nationalism allows them to forget contingency, to ignore that they are part of history, that their story is one among many, and certainly not the greatest. And though their culture is the most intrinsic experience of themselves as human beings, it is not natural, but invented. That said, it might also be reconstructed with more carpenters and with different visions of the building. An overview of this debate begs the question, if the country is always changing and literature is changing, how can a canon, the constructive narrative or fiction of that country, hope to keep up? How have thematic, regional, post-colonial, postmodern paradigms destabilizing the permanent and reverential status of certain ideas, questioning representation itself, and attempting to recover overlooked or dismissed narratives, immigrant and First Nation stories, to name only two of dozens? Where have these notions of nation come from? Which texts? Which critics? I'm going to show you a few of the books that we associate with immigrant and First Nations culture now, but which have largely not been taught in the classroom. Lawrence Hill, Rowanton Mystery, Anita Rabadami, M.G. Visanji, Rawi Hage, Shyam Salvadori, Gil Courtmarsh, Austin Clark, of course our own Victoria Essiedugan, and of course the First Nations writers that we now think of as a large group originally were undiscovered in the classroom. Thomas King, Joseph Boyden, Eden Robinson, Thompson Highway, and of course Richard Wagamies, who was our own writer-in-residence last year. Many of the writers who have talked about what it is to be Canadian, Frank Davey, Robin Matthews, Stanley Fogel, Robert Lecker, George Woodcock, Robert Croach, Northrop Frye, they all thought about what it means to be Canadian because there was a lot of discussion of that in the 70s. John Moss, in Patterns of Isolation, for example, examined exile motifs in Canadian fiction. Also Bill New, Linda Hutchin, Smaro Cambarelli, so many others that drew on post-Canadian, post-colonial, and post-modernism. They were to find the literature was to find the country, they said. This kind of historical expansiveness, international sophistication, and stylistic elegance that has become the signature of the best new Canadian writing has always been there, but it has not always been acknowledged. And the championing of Canadian literature and Canadian content was a movement in the 60s and 70s that corralled all this literary criticism regarding text and nationhood to make an argument for its quality and its instruction in school. But teachers then, and some now, resented the intrusion of what they perceived as a nationalist goal in education and doubted our books were of sufficient maturity to match the classics. For the better part of 20 years, a vanguard of committed publishing, educational, and cultural organizations attempted to persuade the unconvinced that Canadian literature was the equal of all other world literatures and equally worthy of study. A potted history appears to relate exactly how many different institutions were created during that time. And I don't have time to go through them all here, but they include the Canada Council as one of the most crucial, given how much they did to grants for small presses that helped to create the next generation of literature. And now it's been 5 decades since that period, and yet the interplay between teachers, publishers, and these cultural bodies, the educational establishment, still remains remarkably resistant to anything other than incremental change. Educators have been seen by publishers as short-sighted, unimaginative continentalists, imbued with American cultural and educational values, while Canadian publishers have been regarded by educators as inefficient, special pleaders, wrapping second-rate materials in the Canadian flag. It's most unfortunate that a misunderstanding of the motives of the CanCon agenda made this teacher the exception to the rule. A teacher who said that by the end of the course, her kids could know at least 70 names and 1 published work of each, to be able to talk intelligently about 20 writers and to be an expert on 1. A teacher is often the only person in a student's life who's in a position of influence, both reading choice, with respect to reading choice and interest. So I just wanted to show you a few of the books that students said that they could remember in our survey, and to see with a quick show of hands if they were also the books that you might be able to remember. Some of the quotes in the survey were most amusing, but also most depressing. They said, one teacher said, in my own poor opinion, there may be 3 Canadian writers worth reading: Robertson Davies, Mordecai Richler, and Margaret Lawrence. The rest you can have, or rather send away on a Canada Council grant somewhere remote forever. In Mel Hurtig's 1975 survey of grade 12-13 students, one responded, Margaret Atwood, Margaret Lawrence, never heard of them, so they must be Canadian. Others cited Tennyson and Frost as Canadian poets, while naming Hemingway and Salinger as favorite Canadian novelists. One student did say, I think Marshall McLuhan is Canadian. 3 years later, the new Canadian Library's Malcolm Ross convened a conference in Calgary and called for a vote on the top 100 Canadian novels. There was a heated debate about the standard and criteria for selecting the works, the importance of taking into account gender, region, and literature written by First Nations and people of color, and the decision to preference novels over other genres. Almost all of the top 100 were published in the New Canadian Library series. Authors like Lawrence and Davies appeared multiple times. Most authors were writers from Ontario, men, and Anglo-Saxons. Teachers also dismissed many Canadian literary titles as being too mature, too boring, too difficult for a high school audience. Well, if you know any Canadian writers, ask them to write something kids can read. One teacher admonished. They perceived the movement to be in service of securing special status for the nation's literature, rather than supplementing a curriculum that had deliberately or inexplicably omitted it. To add insult to injury, responses to the question, do you think more Canadian literature should be taught, included, not in my classroom, what Canadian literature? And I dislike teaching Canadian literature because it's Canadian. I teach literature, period. The objections reveal a belief that the classroom is the sacred domain of the teacher, that Canadian literature had not yet reached critical mass, and that the author's citizenship did not qualify a literary work for inclusion. In fairness, Canadian content supporters did not argue that because a work was written by a Canadian, it should automatically be included. Naturally, it also had to meet standards applied to any work on the list. But likewise, this adjective was not a reason to exclude it. The counter-argument was that literature was a craft of nuance, and though it may tell us where we came from, even where we are, it rarely invigorates consensus. They conflated overtly political goals of nationalism with subtly cultural ones. An educated imagination is not identical student to student. Variety mitigates against conformity. Canadian literature records what the Canadian imagination has reacted to, and it tells us things about this environment that nothing else can tell us. But it does not tell us what to conclude upon reading it. A show of hands, how many of you could name 5 Canadian novels you read in high school? High school, remember high school? Not too many of you do, from the looks of it. Well, a lot of the literature that you might see in what your nieces and nephews, cousins, children are reading might be the literature that you remember as well. And they are a function of books that are often in the supply closet. And as much as we love teachers, they may forget what you said, but they will not forget how you made them feel, is a truism. A lot of students feel very intimidated by Canadian literature and by literature at large, and so they turn their back on it. But it need not always be that way. They also have this impression that anybody can teach English. A strange extrapolation, perhaps, from the assumption that because we can all speak it, we can all teach it. In fact, there are more teachers of English in language arts departments that have training in other areas than in any other department. If they are assigned a subject for which they have no affinity or interest, how will they recognize themselves in their work? If teachers without training in or enjoyment of English suddenly find themselves teaching it, or worse yet, if they are formerly disgruntled English students themselves, this practice may perpetuate a vicious cycle that harms all parties. There are about 200,000 teachers in Canada, and about 300 of them answered our survey. And we got a lot of information from them, but as you can imagine, it's now a little bit dated. However, we have had some success. In 2008, Jean and I successfully lobbied the BC government to make mandatory one Canadian novel each year of study from grade 8 to grade 12. So, small victories. And in Canada, there are 13 sets of provincial guidelines, and there's also 2 groups, the Western and Northern Canadian Protocol and the Atlantic Provinces Education Foundation. Saskatchewan is the best province in terms of mandatory Canadian literature. It's usually offered in grade 12, but we are catching up happily. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and Ontario offer it as an elective, most often in grade 11 and 12, but often they offer it and then the course doesn't actually happen because they don't have teachers who are interested in teaching it. Most provinces also expect CanLit to be some part of English courses, but it's not monitored to a great extent. So, if most students graduate high school having read less than 5 Canadian titles in the course of their secondary career, one teacher notes, "My students could readily identify over 10 American writers." Perhaps one reason this is the case, in addition to heavy representation of American authors taught in the classroom, is that supplementary literacy courses use American materials to instruct students, reading at lower than normal levels. And English faculty at Canadian universities estimate that as little as 5% of Canadian students have read even one semester of CanLit, where nearly all American students have had at least a full year of study of American literature prior to entering university. So these results are less than encouraging, but they do suggest that if teachers are most likely to decide what to teach, and if they can be persuaded, educated, and motivated to see the personal and the student benefit of teaching from a wider range of available CanLit titles, using a method that shares the workload and increases the motivation for both parties, teachers might come aboard. Not a surefire plan, I agree. Yet this grassroots approach, working within the school walls, holds more promise than enforcing quotas from the top down. What will help? And I just want to end with a short list of things that I think would help teachers to be and feel more qualified, and to think about some of the exciting aspects of teaching literature rather than marking it, and also to think about extending the following titles and the list that basically makes up the Canadian canon to include many, many more titles that I hope you've already read. Of course, the standards are Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, Lawrence's The Stone Angel, Robertson Davies' Fifth Business, Timothy Finley's The Wars, W.O. Mitchell's Who Has Seen the Wind, Farley Mowatt's Owls in the Family, Alice Munro's Lives of Girls and Women, Michael Ondaatje's In the Skin of a Lion, and The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz by Mordecai Richler. Shields has been added more recently, not always this title, The Republic of Love, But when we think about all of the books that could go into the tag cloud of Canadian literature, they go far beyond Atwood's thematic instruction around survival, and the book that is still used to teach a lot of our literature. So what about the living literature? We see it in the Canada Reads programs, and not just this year's active debate. Certainly, it's now been 12 years, I believe, but we also have a lot of other programs on CBC and elsewhere. So, just a couple of things to give you ideas if you're teachers. What can we do for students to make the whole prospect more enticing and to vivify the Canadian literature classroom? Well, off the top of my head, I'd say attendance at a real or virtual book launch, readings, festivals, Victoria, Vancouver, Sechelt, Campbell River, Calgary, Moose Jaw, Winnipeg, Ottawa, Toronto, Halifax, Word on the Street, and our own Nanaimo Festival in about a month. The creation of voluntary school book clubs by genre, field trips to bookstores and libraries, subscriptions to literary magazines, writers in residence in libraries and writers in schools programs, reading and writing workshops in which students select models for their own creative work beyond the independent study, a student-juried literary publication of their own work in print or an online magazine that included essays by students about Canadian books, interviews with authors, student reviews of new titles, information about getting published, contests, a variety of word-of-mouth endorsements for the would-be writer, provincial teen choice awards like BC's Stellar Award, voted on by all registered classrooms, participation in national literature initiatives like the Canadian Children's Book Week, National Poetry Month, Freedom to Read Week, One Book, One City, Canada Reads programs, holding contests to read a nominee from the Gugeler, the Governor General's, the provincial fiction prizes, visiting the All Lit Up site to find a book by a small press author in your own backyard, rewriting novels a la fan fiction, a choose your own adventure, tweeting as your favorite character in the novel of your choice, filming a vlog in which you review the book or partner with a fellow student to do a mock interview about it, recording scenes from the book as podcasts complete with voices and sound effects, filming a book trailer to entice your fellow students to pick the book you want on the list, spoofing a book only after you know it inside and out, reviewing the book on Goodreads or Shelfari or Library Thing, finding other titles of similar profile, writing a press release for the book you studied, recommending its novelty and hook, writing jacket copy for a book you think you read or would want to read as the sequel, creating a video game or app based on the book's central quest or tension, rewriting a section of dialogue in text-speak and then justifying your translation, reimagining a death in the book as a crime scene and acting it out, staging the key movement in the novel in Second Life, imagining the online dating profiles of romantic interests in the book, devising a virtual literary tour of the city in the novel for each of the settings and mapping it on Foursquare, taking photos of each of the scenes in the novel you saw in your mind's eye, posting them on Instagram, writing a blog as one of the characters, charting the timeline of the book and your imagined reactions to events as a protagonist, and the list goes on. This is the final gasp of the lecture in which you hone in on the question for the question period. First among them likely to be, how will we afford the time and money to make all that happen? And I will reply haughtily that most of the costs are imaginative and electronic and temporal. Less bottom line than over the top. Naive, overly keen, trendy, superficial, I beg to differ. These are the gaps in the book that Louise Rosenblatt talked about in her reader response theory. Ways into our stories only possible if we have read fully and deeply and grasped our hidden key for the wardrobe, the garden gate, the teacup room. They may appear placating or gimmicky or too flashy for the teaching of literature, but they employ leisure activities in which teens are already immersed that reflect student habits essential to their digital and entertainment lives. If books are to have a place in that library of the mind, the new will need to come to the aid of the old. In order to nurture what Robertson Davies called a multitude of revolutionary cells, each composed of one intelligent human being and one book of substantial worth, getting down to the immensely serious business of personal exploration through personal pleasure, teachers will have to be inventive and take their cues from the content. It would be an understatement to say that teaching a new range of Canadian works selected by students, but with antiquated attitudes, is counterproductive, to say the least. If we are to live in a world that cherishes language, imagination, art, creativity, inspiration, difference, rebellion, independence, choice, uniqueness, empowerment, alternatives, truth, pleasure, curiosity, empathy, humanity, identity, privacy, context, history, memory, community, and vision, we must also cherish our literature and continue to search for ways to make it a more vital part of our classroom. If a student is intimidated by or resentful of either the works or the act of reading itself, he or she is less likely to benefit from the residual skills enumerated earlier. But that does not mean the skills are non-existent or less valuable. It simply means that the challenge is a worthy one. It is no use insisting on the curative or soulful properties of reading as a means of inciting readers to take up the book. The act must be approached voluntarily and be encouraged deliberately. You can't make people read any more than you can make them love or dream. And like love, it is a way of being. It is a truth worth celebrating and worth teaching that narrative, after facing every conceivable challenge in this century, remains central to our existence. Its infinite gifts belong to the reader and to the student. If the literature is taught with this in mind, students will have no choice but to choose it. Thank you.